What happens when small-town darkness becomes too real to ignore? Welcome to Unheard Fears. Tonight, 9 disturbing true stories from Alberta, where reality twisted into nightmare. In Drumheller's Badlands, geologists found impossible voids defying natural law. In Vulcan, analog footage captured something that shouldn't exist. Names and identifying details have been altered to protect privacy, but every account here is real, documented by witnesses who lived it. Drop your location and what time you're watching in the comments. And subscribe because the most terrifying stories never made headlines. My name is Marcus, and I've spent the last 6 years volunteering at the Vulcan Historical Society, cataloging old media from the town's past. It's quiet work, the kind that lets you disappear into decades-old footage of parades and council meetings without anyone bothering you. In October 1997, I was assigned to digitize a collection of VHS tapes from the town's defunct broadcasting station off Highway 23. The station had shut down in 1989, but the basement was still packed with equipment, rusted broadcasting towers, walls of ancient magnetic tape, and shelves of unlabeled cassettes gathering dust. The Historical Society wanted everything preserved before the building was demolished, so I set up my equipment in that cold concrete room and got to work. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed constantly, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The smell down there was overwhelming. Decades of dust mixed with the chemical tang of degrading magnetic tape and something else I couldn't quite place, like old copper wiring left to corrode. Most of the tapes were exactly what you'd expect. Local news segments from the early 80s, coverage of high school football games, a few Christmas specials that would have made anyone nostalgic. I'd been working alone for 3 weeks when I found the tape that changed everything. It was in a cardboard box, shoved behind a stack of broadcasting manuals, completely unlabeled, except for a piece of masking tape on the spine with a date written in fading marker, October 31st, 1984. I figured it was Halloween programming, maybe some kind of special broadcast the station had done. I popped it into the player, adjusted the tracking, and hit play. The screen filled with static for a few seconds. That familiar VHS snow that used to drive everyone crazy, before resolving into an image. It was grainy footage of Vulcan's Main Street, completely empty. No cars, no people, just the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The camera was panning slowly from left to right, the movement jerky and unnatural, like whoever was filming kept stopping and starting. There was no sound at first, just the hiss of blank audio track, but then I started hearing it. A low whisper buried beneath the white noise. I turned up the volume on my headphones, leaning closer to the monitor. The whisper was backwards. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was deliberate, almost rhythmic. My skin prickled. I kept watching. The camera continued its slow pan across Main Street, and that's when I saw the figure. It appeared in the distant background, near the old hardware store that's been a coffee shop for the last decade. At first, I thought it was just a person, maybe someone who'd wandered into frame during filming, but something about the proportions was wrong. The arms were too long, hanging past where the knees should be. The head seemed to tilt at an angle that didn't match the body's orientation. The figure wasn't walking normally. It moved in stuttering frames like the footage was skipping, even though the rest of the image played smoothly. I felt my mouth go dry. The static on the tape started increasing, crackling bursts of visual noise that made the figure harder to see. The backwards whispering grew louder, overlapping with itself, until it sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. I should have stopped the tape right there. I should have ejected it and walked out of that basement and never come back. But I didn't. I kept watching because I needed to understand what I was seeing. The camera angle finally registered in my brain. I recognized the exact perspective, the height, the slight downward tilt, the position relative to the buildings. It was filming from where I was currently sitting. This footage had been shot from this basement, looking out through a window that had been bricked over years ago. My heart started hammering. The figure on the screen was walking now, moving directly toward the camera position. Toward me. The lights in the basement began to flicker, and I realized with growing horror that they were flickering in rhythm with the bursts of static on the tape. 1, 2, 3 flicker. Static burst. 1, 2, 3 flicker. Static burst. The VHS tracking started distorting, horizontal lines tearing across the image, but I could still see the figure. It was closer now, filling more of the frame, and I could almost make out features in that pixelated, degraded mess of analog video. What I saw wasn't a face. It was something that approximated a face, rendered in grainy video noise. Eyes that were just dark pixels bleeding into lighter ones. A mouth that seemed to open wider than any mouth should. That's when I heard the footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy, deliberate. Coming down. The timestamp on the tape showed 9:47 p.m. I glanced at my watch. 9:47 p.m. exactly. The figure on the screen was now close enough that it filled the entire frame. Just this mass of distorted pixels, and tracking errors, and visual noise that pulsed and shifted. The backwards whispering resolved into actual words for just a second. I swear I heard my name spoken in reverse. And then the tape ended. Just cut to black and static. The footsteps stopped halfway down the stairs. I ripped off my headphones and grabbed my equipment bag, nearly knocking over the monitor in my panic. I didn't look at the stairs. I didn't want to see what was standing there in the dark at the edge of the light. I ran up the opposite stairwell, the one that led directly outside, and I didn't stop running until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. The next morning, I called the Historical Society and told them I'd found something unusual on one of the tapes, something they needed to review. The director, an older woman named Patricia, who'd lived in Vulcan her entire life, asked me to describe it. I told her everything: the empty street, the figure, the backwards voices, the timestamp matching real time. There was a long silence on the phone. Then she said very quietly that she'd send someone to retrieve the equipment, and that I shouldn't worry about finishing the project. She wouldn't elaborate. When I pressed her, she just said the station had a complicated history, and that some things were better left in the past. I asked if they found the tape. She told me there was no tape. They'd gone through that entire box, cataloged every cassette, and found nothing dated October 31st, 1984. According to their records, the station hadn't even broadcast on Halloween that year due to equipment failure. But I know what I saw. Before I ran out of that basement, I'd grabbed my Polaroid camera, the one I used to document particularly interesting finds, and snapped a single photo of the monitor showing that final frame. I still have it. I keep it in a locked drawer in my apartment, and I regret keeping it more than anything I've ever done in my life. The photo shows exactly what was on that screen, a figure rendered in pixels and tracking errors, close enough that you can see it's trying to look like a person, but failing in ways that make your eyes hurt. And if you look at the photo for more than a few seconds, you start to notice things. The pixels shift slightly. The static patterns rearrange themselves. It's subtle enough that you think you're imagining it, but you're not. I haven't looked at that photo in 3 years, but I know it's still changing, still moving. The broadcasting station was demolished in March 1999, 6 months ahead of schedule. The Historical Society cited structural instability, but I heard from someone who worked on the demolition crew that they'd refused to go into the basement. They brought in a different crew from Calgary, workers who didn't ask questions and didn't care about the town's history. They tore that building down in 2 days and hauled everything to a landfill in Red Deer. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought destroying the physical location would somehow break whatever connection existed between that tape and that place. I was wrong. I still see that face, if you can call it a face, in digital noise. When my TV loses signal and fills with static, I catch glimpses of those same pixel patterns. When I'm scrolling through my phone late at night and the screen glitches for a fraction of a second, I see those empty eyes staring back at me. I can't watch old footage anymore. I had to quit my position at the Historical Society. I work in data entry now, something with numbers and spreadsheets that has nothing to do with video or film or magnetic tape. Last week, I got a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a DVD-R in a plain white sleeve with a date written in Sharpie, October 31st, 2024. I haven't played it. I don't know if I ever will, but I can hear something when I hold it up to my ear. A faint whisper, like audio bleeding through plastic, speaking words I don't understand in a voice that sounds like mine played backwards. Sometimes I think about destroying it, smashing it into pieces and burning those pieces and scattering the ashes, but I'm afraid of what that might release. I'm afraid that the only thing keeping whatever's on that disc contained is the fact that I haven't watched it yet. So it sits in my drawer, next to that Polaroid photo, waiting. And every October 31st, at exactly 9:47 p.m., my phone rings. No caller ID. When I answer, all I hear is static and that backwards whispering, getting clearer each year. One day I'll understand what it's saying. One day those words will resolve into something I can comprehend. I don't know what happens then. I don't know what it wants. But I know it's been waiting since 1984, and I know that I opened something that was never meant to be found. The tape was never cataloged. Officially, it never existed. But I held it in my hands. I watched what was recorded there. And now, somewhere in the space between analog and digital, between what was and what is, something knows my name. Have you ever found something you wish you could unsee? My name is Ezekiel, and I used to believe the universe operated according to laws we could measure and understand. I was 26 in February 2015, working on my master's thesis in geophysics at the University of Calgary. My research focused on ground-penetrating radar applications in paleontological surveys, specifically analyzing Cretaceous formations in the Alberta Badlands. It was dry, technical work that involved more math than adventure, but I loved it. There was something satisfying about using modern technology to peer into ancient geology, to reconstruct environments that existed 70 million years before humans walked the earth. My supervisor had arranged for me to conduct field surveys in a remote section of the Red Deer River Valley near Drumheller, an area where erosion had exposed particularly interesting rock layers. I drove out there on a Monday morning in mid-February, the kind of bitter prairie winter day where the sky is so clear it hurts to look at and your breath freezes in your nostrils. The survey site was about 3 kilometers from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking down into the valley through terrain that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The Badlands are unlike anywhere else on Earth. All these bizarre hoodoos and striped rock formations carved by wind and water into shapes that seemed deliberately strange. I set up my equipment on a flat section of exposed bedrock, calibrated the ground-penetrating radar array, and started my first pass. The technology works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the Earth and measuring how those pulses bounce back, creating a profile of subsurface structures. I was looking for bone beds, concentrated deposits of fossils that would support my thesis arguments about prehistoric riverine environments. What I found instead made me question everything I thought I understood about geology, about physics, about the nature of reality itself. The initial radar returns looked normal for the first 50 meters of depth, sedimentary layers, exactly what I expected. Then, at around 180 meters down, the readings changed. The equipment was showing a void, a massive empty space in the rock that had no business existing. But it wasn't the size that alarmed me. It was the geometry. The void was perfectly angular. Straight edges, right angles, dimensions that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural formation. I ran the survey again, triple-checking my calibration. Same results. I called my supervisor that evening from my motel room in Drumheller. He listened to my description, asked a few technical questions about my methodology, then suggested my equipment was malfunctioning. Rock doesn't form geometric voids at that depth. It's geologically impossible. He told me to rerun the survey the next day with fresh batteries and recalibrated sensors. I lay awake most of that night staring at the printed readouts spread across the motel bed, trying to find some explanation that fit within accepted scientific frameworks. I couldn't. The next morning, I returned to the site alone. My supervisor had other commitments, and this was my project anyway. I set up the equipment again, this time using a different section of the radar array to eliminate any possibility of hardware failure. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the wind coming through the valley carried tiny ice crystals that stung exposed skin. I started the survey at dawn, watching the data populate on my laptop screen in real time. The void appeared again, exactly where it had been the day before. 200 meters down, geometric and impossible. But something else happened during that second survey. Something I didn't notice until I was reviewing the data later. The timestamp anomalies. According to my equipment logs, the survey had taken 6 hours and 43 minutes. According to my watch and the position of the sun, only 2 hours had passed. I checked my phone. Same thing. 2 hours. But my laptop insisted otherwise, and the battery drain supported that claim. 6 hours of continuous operation. I felt something shift in my chest, a cold weight settling behind my ribs. Time doesn't just skip forward. That's not how physics works. That's not how anything works. I should have packed up my equipment right then and driven back to Calgary. I should have reported equipment failure and requested different hardware. But I didn't. I did what any scientist would do when confronted with impossible data. I tried to gather more evidence. I spent the next 3 days drilling core samples, using a portable rig I'd borrowed from the geology department. The drilling was slow work, and I could only reach about 180 meters with the equipment I had. But at 179 meters, the bit brought up something that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped the sample. The rock was wrong. The surface was too smooth, almost polished, like it had been machined rather than formed through geological processes. And there were markings on it, shallow grooves arranged in patterns that resembled mathematical notation, but followed no system I recognized. The symbols looked intentional, precise, carved with purpose. When I held the sample, I noticed it was warmer than the surrounding rock. Not by much, maybe 2 or 3 degrees, but consistent and measurable. That shouldn't happen. At that depth, temperature should follow predictable geothermal gradients. This rock was generating its own heat, or conducting it from somewhere deeper. I spent that entire evening in my motel room analyzing the sample, photographing the markings from every angle, running spectroscopic tests with my portable kit. The rock's composition was ordinary sandstone, nothing unusual about its mineral content. But those markings, those patterns, they suggested knowledge of geometric principles that humanity had only formalized in the last few centuries. Whoever or whatever had carved them understood mathematics at a level that felt profoundly wrong for something buried in Cretaceous stone. I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed of vast spaces beneath the earth, of angles that bent in directions that didn't exist, of something waiting in geometric darkness. On the 5th night, I made a mistake. I returned to the survey site after dark, drawn by an impulse I couldn't explain rationally. I told myself I wanted to observe the location at a different time of day to see if environmental factors affected the radar readings. That was a lie. The truth was, I felt compelled to be there, to stand above that impossible void under the winter stars. The Badlands at night are profoundly dark, the kind of darkness that feels almost solid. I used a headlamp to navigate down into the valley, the beam cutting narrow tunnels through the black. When I reached the survey site, I turned off the lamp and let my eyes adjust. The stars were incredible. Dense clusters of light smearing across the sky in patterns I'd seen 1,000 times before. Except they weren't the same patterns. I'm not an astronomer, but I know the basic constellations. I've navigated by stars on camping trips, oriented myself using Polaris and the Big Dipper since I was a kid. But standing there, above that geometric void, the stars were wrong, shifted, just slightly, just enough to make familiar patterns feel alien and threatening. I pulled out my phone to check a star chart app, but my hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped it. The app showed the constellations exactly where they should be. I looked up at the actual sky. Different. The positions didn't match. I stood there for what felt like an hour, alternating between the app and the sky, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I felt it. A vibration through the soles of my boots, so low I heard it more in my bones than my ears. A subsonic hum emanating from the ground beneath me, pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. And with that vibration came a certainty I can't explain and couldn't shake. Something vast and ancient was aware of me. Not just aware, interested. I was an insect that had crawled too close to something incomprehensibly large, and now it had noticed. The fear that washed over me wasn't the kind you feel when threatened by a predator, or danger you can fight or flee from. This was existential terror, the sudden understanding that everything you believe about your place in the universe is a comfortable fiction, and the reality is so much stranger and more terrible than you could have imagined. I ran. I don't remember the hike back to my vehicle, don't remember the drive to Drumheller. I found myself in the motel parking lot with no memory of how I got there. My headlamp still on, draining the battery, casting useless light against my windshield. The next morning, I called my supervisor and told him I was experiencing equipment failure and needed to suspend the survey. He was disappointed but understanding. These things happen in field research. I packed my equipment, drove back to Calgary, and submitted a preliminary report citing technical difficulties and recommending the site be reclassified pending environmental review. 3 months later, I received notice that drilling permits for that section of the Badlands had been denied indefinitely. No explanation given. Just a bureaucratic letter stating that the area was now closed to geological surveys pending unspecified review. My supervisor warned me about pursuing the matter further. He didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. Some research directions are career-limiting. Some questions don't have answers you want to find. I finished my thesis using data from different sites, graduated, and took a job with an oil company doing routine surveys in conventional geology. Safe work, predictable work. But I still have that core sample. Locked in a safety deposit box in a bank downtown. I still have the photos of those impossible markings. And I still have the star charts from that night, the ones that showed me a sky that didn't match reality, or showed me reality we normally can't see. I don't know which is worse. Sometimes I pull up geological survey maps and look at that section of the Badlands, the area marked restricted since 2016. I wonder what's down there in that geometric void, what created it, and when and why. I wonder if it's still there, or if it exists in dimensions we can't measure with our equipment. Mostly I wonder if disturbing it was the worst thing I could have done, if my radar pulses and drilling woke something that had been dormant for millions of years. Last week I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line. Just a single attached image. It was a satellite photo of the survey site, recent enough to show this year's snow coverage. In the center of the restricted area, the snow had melted in a perfect geometric pattern, the same angles and proportions as the void my radar had detected 200 meters down. The pattern was new. It wasn't there in last year's satellite imagery. Something is changing beneath that ground, rising or expanding or becoming more active. And I'm the only person who knows what's down there, the only one who's measured it and touched samples of its edges. Sometimes I think I should report it to someone, some government agency or scientific body that handles unexplained phenomena. But who would believe me? And more importantly, what could anyone do about something that vast, that ancient, that fundamentally wrong? Have you ever discovered something you immediately wished you could forget? My name is Sullivan, and the summer of 2003 was supposed to be simple. I was 23, fresh out of college with a degree I didn't know what to do with. So when my uncle offered me work as a ranch hand on his property near Cardston, I jumped at it. The pay was decent, the work was honest, and I figured a few months of physical labor under the Alberta sky would help me figure out what came next. My uncle's ranch sat on the edge of Blood Indian Reserve territory, sprawling acres of grassland that stretched toward the mountains in the distance. The cattle grazed in rotating pastures. In most days, I'd ride out on horseback to check fences and move the herd. It was peaceful work, the kind that let your mind wander while your body stayed busy. But there was one section of the property my uncle never sent me to, the northwest pasture. About 40 acres bordered by a line of cottonwood trees remained empty all summer. No cattle, no equipment, just tall grass swaying in the wind. I asked him about it my second week there, during dinner in the ranch house kitchen. He was a quiet man, my uncle, the kind who measured his words carefully. When I mentioned the northwest pasture, he stopped cutting his steak and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said the cattle wouldn't graze there anyway, that they'd been refusing that land since before his father bought the property in 1967. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he didn't smile. He just told me to leave it alone and went back to his meal. The way he said it, flat and final, made me decide not to push. But curiosity has a way of festering, especially when you're young and bored and spending 10 hours a day with nothing but cows and sky for company. 3 weeks into my stay, I rode out to the northwest pasture on my own. It was late afternoon, the sun starting its slow descent toward the Rockies, casting everything in gold and amber light. The grass there grew differently, thicker, darker, like it fed on something the rest of the ranch didn't have. I dismounted near the cottonwood line and walked into the pasture, leading my horse by the reins. That's when I found the circle. It was massive, maybe 40 feet across, a perfect ring of dead grass that looked like it had been burned or poisoned decades ago. Nothing grew inside that circle. Not a single blade of grass, not a weed, nothing. The earth was hard-packed and gray, like ash mixed into soil. Arranged around the perimeter were stones, river rocks worn smooth by water, placed in patterns that didn't make sense to me. Geometric shapes that interlocked in ways that hurt to look at for too long. In the center of the circle were wooden stakes, maybe a dozen of them, weathered gray and leaning at slight angles. Each stake had symbols carved into it, markings that didn't match any language I recognized. They looked old, the kind of old that precedes history books and proper records. I stood there staring at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. My horse pulled against the reins, snorting and tossing her head. She didn't want to be there. Smart animal. I should have listened to her. Instead, I walked closer to the circle's edge, close enough to see that the stones had markings too. Faint scratches that might have been letters, or might have been random weathering. The air inside the circle felt different, heavier, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees the moment I stepped past those stones. I could smell something too. Sage, maybe, or sweetgrass, but underneath that was something else. Something organic and old, like earth that hadn't been disturbed in a very long time. I reached out to touch one of the wooden stakes, and that's when I heard Cheyenne calling my name. She was my uncle's wife, a woman in her 50s, who'd grown up on the neighboring ranch. She was standing at the tree line, arms crossed, watching me with an expression that might have been anger or might have been fear. She told me to step out of the circle. Not asked. Told. Her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. I backed away from the stakes, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt standing in that dead grass. Cheyenne waited until I'd crossed back over the stone perimeter before she spoke again. She asked me what the hell I thought I was doing, why I'd come here when my uncle had specifically told me to stay away. I stammered something about curiosity, about wanting to understand what this place was. She shook her head slowly and told me there were things on this land that predated both our families, agreements made by people who understood what lived in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. She wouldn't elaborate. When I pressed her, asking what kind of agreements, she just said the old families knew how to coexist with what was here, and that disturbing certain places was the fastest way to break those arrangements. That night at dinner, neither Cheyenne nor my uncle mentioned the incident. They talked about the weather, about cattle prices, about needing to replace a section of fence on the eastern boundary. But I caught them exchanging glances, quick looks loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. I felt like a child who'd stumbled into adult business I wasn't equipped to understand. I tried to forget about the circle, tried to focus on my work, but it lingered in my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. 2 weeks passed. The summer heat intensified, turning the grasslands brown and the sky a pale, washed-out blue. I was sleeping in the small bunkhouse near the barn, a converted storage building with a cot and a fan that barely worked. I'd gotten used to the sounds of the ranch at night, cattle lowing in the distance, wind rattling the barn doors, coyotes yapping in the hills. So when I woke up at what my watch said was 3 a.m, I knew immediately something was different. The silence was wrong. No wind, no animals, just complete, suffocating quiet. I got up and walked to the window, and that's when I saw them. 7 figures dressed in white, standing around the perimeter of the northwest pasture circle. Even from a quarter-mile away, I could see them clearly in the moonlight. They stood perfectly still, evenly spaced around the circle like markers on a clock face. I recognized one of them by her silhouette. Cheyenne, my uncle's wife, who should have been asleep in the main house with him. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I watched as the figures began to move, all of them at once, walking the circle's edge in a counterclockwise direction. They moved with an unnatural synchronization, their steps matching perfectly, even though they were too far apart to see each other. And they were chanting. I couldn't hear the words through the bunkhouse walls, but I could feel them. A vibration that traveled through the ground and up through the foundation and into my bones. I felt something else, too. A pull. A compulsion that started as a whisper in the back of my mind and grew louder with each passing second. I needed to join them. I needed to walk that circle. I needed to be part of whatever was happening out there in the dead grass under the summer moon. My hand was on the door handle before I realized I was moving. I was turning the knob when someone grabbed my shoulder hard enough to spin me around. My uncle stood there in his undershirt and jeans, boots unlaced, breathing hard like he'd run from the house. His face was drawn tight with something that looked like fear and exhaustion mixed together. He said one word, "Stay." Then he told me not to go to the window, not to watch, not to think about what was happening out there. He said it wasn't for me, that it was never meant for me, and that some things in this world operated on rules I'd never understand. He stayed with me in that bunkhouse until sunrise, sitting in the only chair while I lay on the cot, neither of us speaking. When morning came, he finally left. I waited until I heard his truck drive off toward the south pasture before I walked back to the northwest corner. The circle was exactly as I'd found it weeks earlier, except for one detail. In the very center, where the wooden stakes stood, someone had placed fresh wildflowers, purple lupines and Indian paintbrush, arranged in a neat bundle like an offering. The flowers were still wet with dew, their petals perfect and unblemished. I never asked about them. Cheyenne went about her morning routine as if nothing had happened, making breakfast, and listening to the radio while my uncle read the newspaper at the kitchen table. But I caught her looking at me once, just for a moment, and in her eyes was something that might have been pity or might have been relief. My uncle paid me for the full summer at the end of August, even though I left 2 weeks early. He didn't ask why I was cutting my stay short, and I didn't offer an explanation. We both knew. Years later, after I'd moved to Calgary and started a life that had nothing to do with ranches or cattle or rural Alberta, I looked up the property on satellite images. You can see everything from space now, every road and building and fence line rendered in digital clarity. The northwest pasture is still there. The circle is still visible, a perfect ring of barren earth surrounded by grass that grows too green, too thick. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what those 7 figures were doing out there, what language they were chanting, what agreements they were maintaining. I wonder if my uncle and Cheyenne still walk that circle on certain nights, keeping something contained or keeping something satisfied. I wonder what would happen if they stopped. The property is still in my family. My uncle died in 2019, left the ranch to his daughter, who lives in Vancouver and has no interest in running cattle. She rents the land to a corporate farming operation now. I called her last year and asked if the new tenants use the northwest pasture. She said they tried to once, back in 2020, but the equipment kept breaking down, and 2 of their workers quit without explanation after spending a single afternoon trying to clear the stones. So they leave it alone. They work around it. They maintain the old agreements without understanding what they're agreeing to. I still think about that night sometimes, about the pull I felt toward that circle, about how close I came to walking out there and joining whatever ritual was taking place in the dark. I don't know what would have happened if my uncle hadn't stopped me. I don't know if I would have come back. But I know that there are places in this world where old rules still apply, where the agreements made by previous generations hold more weight than property deeds and fence lines. And I know that some circles, once drawn, are never meant to be crossed. The land remembers things we've forgotten. The stones hold knowledge we were never supposed to have. And in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear, something still walks counterclockwise under the summer moon, chanting in languages that predate words. What would you do if you felt an unexplainable pull toward something you knew was dangerous? My name is Gianna, and before November 2019, I thought I understood the difference between paranoia and intuition. I was 31, working as an insurance adjuster in Pincher Creek, a job that required attention to detail and a healthy skepticism about people's claims. I'd moved into a small rental house on Maple Avenue 6 months earlier, a 1-story bungalow with a basement I rarely used, and a landlord who lived 2 hours away in Lethbridge. The house was fine. Nothing special, but it had good light, and the rent was affordable. I lived alone, which suited me perfectly after ending a relationship that had dragged on 2 years past its expiration date. Solitude felt like freedom. At least it did until I started noticing the small disruptions. It began with a coffee mug. I'm particular about certain habits. The kind of person who puts things in specific places without thinking about it. My morning mug always went on the right side of the sink after I washed it. Always. One Tuesday in early November, I found it on the left side. I stared at it for a full minute, trying to remember if I'd been distracted the night before, if I'd deviated from routine without noticing. It seemed possible. People make small mistakes all the time. But the feeling that something was wrong settled into my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Over the next week, other things shifted. The TV remote ended up face down on the coffee table when I always left it face up. A book I'd been reading moved from my nightstand to the kitchen counter. Small things, easily dismissed. I told myself I was stressed, that work had me distracted, that living alone meant no one else to blame for my own absent-mindedness. Then the basement door started opening. I kept that door locked because the basement creeped me out. All concrete walls and exposed pipes, and a smell like damp earth that never quite went away. 3 mornings in a row, I came downstairs to find the door standing open, the darkness beyond it seeming to breathe cold air into the house. I checked the lock. It worked fine. I started testing it before bed, rattling the knob to make sure it caught properly. It did. But every morning, open. On the 4th morning, I called my landlord, Joaquin, a man in his 60s who owned several rental properties around town. He drove down that afternoon and spent 20 minutes examining the door, the frame, the lock mechanism. He couldn't find anything wrong. He suggested the house settling might be causing the latch to slip, offered to install a deadbolt. I agreed, watched him drill and install the new hardware, felt a surge of relief when he handed me the key. The deadbolt didn't help. 2 nights later, I woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. A text from my sister in Calgary, responding to something I'd sent an hour earlier. Except I'd been asleep an hour earlier. I opened my messages and felt my stomach drop. At 2:17 a.m., I'd apparently sent her a long text about how I was thinking of visiting for Christmas, asking about her kids' schedules, mentioning a restaurant we should try. The tone was casual, normal, completely me. I had no memory of writing it. None. I called her immediately, not caring about the hour. She was confused by my panic. Said the text had seemed totally normal. Asked if I was okay. I lied and said I'd been sleepwalking, that it had happened before. After we hung up, I sat in bed with every light in the house on, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had written it in some half-asleep state, some fugue between waking and dreaming, where the conscious mind goes offline but motor functions continue. It happened to people. It had to have happened to me. But I didn't believe it. That stone in my chest had grown heavier, colder, spreading ice through my ribs. Something was wrong with this house, or something was wrong with me, and I didn't know which possibility terrified me more. I bought a cheap motion-activated camera from the hardware store and set it up in the living room, angled to capture both the basement door and the stairs leading up to my bedroom. If something was happening while I slept, I'd have proof. I'd have evidence. The first night of recording showed nothing unusual. Just darkness and the occasional shift of shadows when car headlights swept past the front window. The second night, the camera captured the basement door opening at 3:17 a.m. I watched the footage 6 times, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. The door just swung open smooth and deliberate, as if someone had turned the handle and pulled. But no one was visible. No hand, no figure, no distortion in the air. The door opened from the inside, stayed open for exactly 46 minutes according to the timestamp, then closed again, all by itself. I should have left right then. I should have packed a bag and driven to a motel and never come back. Instead, I did what scared people do when they can't accept what they're seeing. I looked for rational explanations. I researched electromagnetic fields and how they might affect electronics. I checked for carbon monoxide leaks. I called a locksmith who confirmed there was nothing wrong with any of the locks in the house. I was grasping at science and logic because the alternative was admitting that something impossible was happening, and my brain refused to process that. On a Thursday night, 2 weeks after the disruption started, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, every creak and groan making my pulse spike. At 2 a.m. I heard breathing in the hallway outside my bedroom door, not loud, not theatrical. Just the quiet, steady sound of someone inhaling and exhaling standing on the other side of that thin wooden barrier. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called the police, whispering into the speaker that someone was in my house. The dispatcher stayed on the line while officers were dispatched, asking questions I answered in monosyllables, every word feeling too loud. The breathing stopped while I was on the phone. Just stopped, like whoever or whatever had been there simply ceased to exist. The police arrived within 10 minutes, 2 officers who cleared the house room by room with flashlights and professional efficiency. They found the basement window unlocked from the inside, its latch turned to the open position. They found fresh mud on the basement floor, a trail that led from the window to the stairs and then stopped. No footprints on the stairs themselves, no mud anywhere else, just that one trail that ended at the boundary between basement and house, as if whoever left it had evaporated at the threshold. The officers took a report, suggested I might want to stay somewhere else for the night, recommended better locks and maybe a security system. After they left, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to think clearly through the fear that had turned my thoughts into white noise. Someone had been in my house multiple times while I slept, watching me, moving my things, using my phone. The police had found evidence, the window, the mud. This wasn't paranoia or carbon monoxide or electromagnetic fields. This was real. I packed a bag and drove to a motel, called in sick to work the next day, and started looking for a new place to live. But before I left town to stay with my sister while I figured things out, I went back to the house one more time in daylight to grab more clothes. That's when I found the note on the kitchen table, written in pen on a piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was mine. Perfect loops and spacing, the exact way I formed letters, identical to every grocery list and work note I'd ever written. It said, "I've been watching you sleep." I stood there, staring at that note for so long, the shadows in the room shifted with the sun's movement across the sky. I had no memory of writing it. The paper wasn't from any notebook I owned, but a handwriting expert I paid $300 to consult later confirmed what I already knew. It was my writing. My hand had formed those letters. Whether I was conscious when I did it or whether someone had perfectly mimicked my handwriting style, neither possibility offered any comfort. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and forfeiting my deposit. Joaquin was understanding, didn't ask too many questions, probably figured I'd had a bad experience and wanted out. He had the place rented to new tenants within 3 weeks. I didn't think about them much, tried to forget that house existed, tried to rebuild some sense of safety in a new apartment across town with better locks and motion lights and a security system I probably didn't need. 6 months later, I got a Facebook message from a woman I didn't know. Her profile picture showed her standing in front of my old house on Maple Avenue. She said she'd found my information through mutual friends, that she needed to ask me something important about the rental property. We met for coffee, and she looked exhausted in a way I recognized immediately. She told me she'd been finding things moved in the house, small things at first. Then she started getting texts from herself, messages sent while she was asleep. She'd installed cameras. She'd called the police. And then she'd found something I hadn't. A journal, hidden in the basement wall behind a loose section of drywall. Pages and pages covered in handwriting that she eventually realized was hers, even though she had no memory of writing any of it. Entries describing daily routines, observations about sleeping positions, notes about habits and patterns, like someone studying her, except that someone was apparently her. She showed me photos of the pages on her phone, and my blood went cold. I recognized my own handwriting in several of the entries dated from my time in that house. Descriptions of my morning routine, notes about how deeply I slept, comments about whether I locked the bedroom door at night. I had written those entries, my hand, my pen, my observations about my own life, recorded in my own writing, while some part of my mind I couldn't access, watched and documented and planned. The woman asked me if I knew what was happening, if I'd experienced anything similar. I told her everything. The moved objects, the basement door, the breathing, the texts, the note. We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, comparing experiences, trying to understand what that house did or what we did in that house. We never found answers. She moved out a week later. Joaquin had the place professionally cleaned, brought in a priest to bless it even though he wasn't religious, then sold the property entirely. I still don't know if what happened to me in that house was supernatural or psychological. I don't know if something in that basement influenced us, made us do things we couldn't remember, or if the house simply revealed something about the human mind that most people never encounter. The dissociative episodes, if that's what they were, never happened again after I left. No more missing time, no more unexplained texts or notes. But I know that journal existed. I know my handwriting filled those pages with observations I don't remember making. And I know that somewhere in my brain, some part of me was conscious and aware and watching myself live, recording details in secret, writing messages I'd later find and not recognize. The woman from the house, we still message sometimes. Neither of us has answers. Neither of us feels safe in quite the same way we did before. We both understand now that the most terrifying invasions aren't the ones that come from outside, but the ones that might come from within, from parts of ourselves we can't access or control. Could you trust your own mind if it started keeping secrets from you? My name is Wade, and I've spent 28 years working forestry in Alberta. I grew up hunting with my father in the bush north of Edmonton, learned to track deer before I could drive, and spent more nights under canvas than most people spend in hotels. By August 2008, when I took a timber survey contract near Rocky Mountain House, I figured I'd seen everything the wilderness had to offer. Black bears that stood 7 feet tall, cougars moving silent as smoke through underbrush, wolves that watched you from ridge lines with eyes that calculated whether you were prey or competition. None of it scared me. The forest was home, familiar territory governed by rules I understood. Animals behaved predictably. They had patterns, territories, survival instincts that made sense. What I found in those woods near the North Saskatchewan River didn't follow any rules I recognized, and it sure as hell wasn't an animal I could classify or explain. The Forestry Service had me surveying old growth timber in a section of Crown land they were considering for selective harvesting. Dense spruce and pine, terrain that rolled in gentle hills cut by seasonal creeks. Undergrowth thick enough that you needed a machete in places. I was working alone, which I preferred. Just me, my GPS, my surveying equipment, and a satellite phone for emergencies. The work was methodical. Mark trees, measure diameters, record coordinates, estimate board feet. I'd established a base camp near an access road and spent my days hiking transects through the forest, returning each evening to my tent and campfire. It was good work, quiet work, the kind that let you exist in that space between thought and instinct where the body moves and the mind drifts. 3 days into the survey, I found the deer carcass suspended 15 feet up in a Douglas fir. At first glance, I thought maybe a bear had cached it, dragging it up into the branches for later consumption. But bears don't cache prey in trees, not at that height, and they don't drain carcasses of blood without eating the meat. This deer hung from a fork in the trunk, positioned deliberately, its hide intact, but the body deflated, like someone had punctured it and let all the fluid drain out. The ground beneath showed no pooled blood, no struggle, no indication of how the animal had gotten up there. I circled the tree, studying the bark for claw marks or abrasions. Nothing. The trunk was smooth, undisturbed. Whatever put that deer in the canopy had done so without leaving traces I could read. The smell was wrong, too. Not the sweet rot of decay, but something chemical and organic mixed together, like formaldehyde and compost and something else I couldn't name. It made my sinuses burn and left a taste like copper pennies on the back of my tongue. I should have reported it to the regional wildlife officer, logged the coordinates, and moved to a different survey section. Professional distance, document, and move on. But I'm curious by nature, trained to investigate anomalies, and this qualified as the strangest thing I'd encountered in 3 decades of fieldwork. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The birdsong in this section of forest was absent, not sparse. Absent. In 40 acres surrounding that suspended carcass, I didn't hear a single bird call for the rest of that day. No ravens, no jays, no woodpeckers hammering distant trees. Just wind through branches and my boots crunching deadfall. By evening, I'd found 3 more drained carcasses, all hoisted into trees at heights that made no sense. A coyote, 2 more deer, all positioned deliberately, all exsanguinated, all reeking of that chemical organic smell that seemed to coat the inside of my throat. That night in camp, I radioed my supervisor, Kezia, back at the regional office in Rocky Mountain House. She'd been coordinating forestry surveys for 15 years, had heard every bizarre wildlife story contractors could invent. I described what I'd found, tried to keep the unease out of my voice, asked if she'd heard of bears or cougars exhibiting this kind of behavior. The radio silence lasted long enough that I thought we'd lost connection. Then she asked me to repeat the location coordinates. I did. Another pause. She told me to photograph the carcasses, mark the locations on my GPS, and move my survey to the eastern transects tomorrow. Don't investigate further. Don't disturb the sites. She'd contact wildlife services, and they'd send someone to examine the area. Her tone had shifted from professional curiosity to something harder, more directive. I asked if there had been previous incidents in this area. She said she'd call me back in the morning and signed off. I didn't sleep well that night. The forest sounds were wrong. Too quiet in some frequencies, too loud in others. I kept hearing movement in the undergrowth just beyond my firelight, circles of disturbance that suggested something large pacing the perimeter of my camp. I told myself it was deer or elk or maybe a curious bear checking out the smoke. But bears don't pace like that. They investigate or leave. They don't orbit. Around 3 a.m. I heard something else. A sound that started low, almost subsonic, then rose into frequencies that made my teeth ache. It wasn't quite a howl and wasn't quite a scream. It had elements of both, layered with something that sounded mechanical, like vocal cords made of materials that shouldn't produce sound. The noise came from maybe 200 yards east, echoed through the valley, then cut off abruptly. Every hair on my body stood up. I sat by that fire with my rifle across my knees until dawn, feeding logs into flames I refused to let die. Keziah called at first light. She told me wildlife services had reviewed historical reports from this area and found patterns going back to 2006. Unusual animal deaths, equipment malfunctions, 3 contractors who'd refused to return to their survey sites without explanation. She said a team would arrive by helicopter in 2 days to investigate, and until then I should relocate to a different section or return to town. I should have taken that option. I should have packed my gear, driven back to Rocky Mountain House, and collected my pay for work completed. But I'm stubborn, and I don't like leaving jobs unfinished, and some part of me needed to understand what I was dealing with. So I moved my camp 3 kilometers south, closer to the access road, and continued surveying. But I also started tracking whatever had created those caches. The prints I found that afternoon redefined everything I thought I understood about wildlife in these mountains. They were pressed into soft earth near a creek crossing, clear enough to photograph and measure. 5 toes, elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. Each print measured 18 inches from heel to longest toe. The stride pattern indicated bipedal locomotion, something walking upright on 2 legs with a gait that covered 8 feet between steps. I'd studied animal tracking since I was 12 years old. I knew black bear prints, grizzly prints, every ungulate and predator in these forests. This matched nothing in my experience or education. The depth of the impressions suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds, probably more. The spacing indicated something between 7 and 9 feet tall. And the pattern of movement, the way the prints appeared and disappeared, suggested intelligence. This thing was using the creek bed to mask its trail, stepping on rocks where it could, only leaving prints where soft ground was unavoidable. I followed those prints for half a kilometer, my pulse hammering in my ears, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The trail led to a shallow cave formed by an overhang of limestone, barely deep enough to call a cave but providing shelter from weather. The smell intensified as I approached, that chemical organic mix so strong it made my eyes water. Inside the cave I found bones, dozens of animal skulls arranged in ascending order by size. Squirrels to deer to what looked like elk, all picked clean, all positioned with deliberate care. Someone or something had created a display, a collection organized according to principles I didn't understand. I was photographing the arrangement when I heard breathing behind me. Heavy. Wet. The sound of lungs pushing air through passages not quite designed for the task. I turned slowly, rifle coming up instinctively, and saw the silhouette blocking the cave entrance. The proportions were wrong immediately. Shoulders too wide, easily 4 feet across. Arms too long, hanging past where knees should be on a human frame. The head tilted at an angle that didn't match the body's orientation, like someone had mounted it incorrectly on the neck. Afternoon sun behind it rendered details invisible, reducing the figure to pure shadow, but I could see enough. This wasn't human. This wasn't bear. This was something else entirely. Something that occupied a space in nature I hadn't known existed. It made a sound, and that sound froze every muscle in my body. It spoke. Not words, but a perfect mimicry of Keziah's voice from my radio conversation the night before. It repeated her exact phrasing, her cadence, her vocal patterns. Don't investigate further. Don't disturb the sights. The voice came from that shadow, mechanically perfect reproduction of human speech from something that had never been human. I fired the flare gun I carried for emergencies. Pure panic response, no conscious thought involved. The magnesium burn filled that cave with light so bright it hurt, and in that flash I saw it clearly for maybe 2 seconds. Skin that looked like it was covered in coarse hair but might have been something else. Hands with too many joints in the fingers. A face that tried to approximate human features, but got the geometry wrong. Eyes too far apart. Mouth that opened wider than any jaw should hinge. It recoiled from the light, with a sound that blended screaming and laughter. A noise that should have been 2 separate things, but emerged as one horrible synthesis. I ran, dropped my rifle, dropped my pack, dropped everything except the instinct to put distance between myself and that cave. I crashed through underbrush, branches tearing my face and hands, lungs burning, listening to it pursue. It moved fast, impossibly fast for something that size, crashing through the forest like a truck, matching my pace for what felt like hours, but was probably 2 kilometers. Then it stopped, just ceased pursuit as abruptly as it had started. I reached my truck, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the regional office, walked into Keziah's workspace covered in scratches and mud, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression carefully neutral. When I finished, she made 2 phone calls, conversations I wasn't privy to, then told me to take the rest of the week off with pay. Wildlife Services would handle the site. My survey data was sufficient for preliminary assessment. She thanked me for the work and suggested I didn't discuss the incident with other contractors. Not a direct order, but the implication was clear. This wasn't something the Forestry Service wanted publicized. I took my payment, drove home to my apartment in Red Deer, and spent 3 days drinking and trying to convince myself I'd misidentified what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing upright. Maybe the cave shadows and stress had distorted my perception. Maybe the voice mimicry was explainable through some acoustic phenomenon I didn't understand. But I knew better. I knew what I'd heard and seen and smelled. That thing in the forest wasn't any species currently recognized by science, and it possessed intelligence sophisticated enough to observe humans, record our speech, and reproduce it with perfect accuracy. The Forestry Service closed that survey area from 2009 to 2012, citing habitat restoration concerns. No harvesting, No surveys, no public access. When they reopened it in 2012, I wasn't offered any contracts in that region. Neither were three other contractors who'd worked those transects between 2006 and 2008. Keziah retired in 2010, moved to the coast, declined to respond when I tried to contact her years later. I kept working forestry until 2015, but I never took another solo contract, and I never went back to that section of the North Saskatchewan River Valley. I still have the photographs from that cave, the skull arrangement, the tracks. One blurry image of the silhouette in the entrance, too degraded by backlighting to show details, but enough to prove something was there. I've shown them to biologists, cryptozoologists, anyone who might offer explanation. No one has answers. Just speculation about undiscovered primate species, or misidentified wildlife, or elaborate hoaxes. But hoaxes don't mimic human voices. Hoaxes don't arrange skulls by size or drain carcasses without leaving traces. Whatever lives in those mountains isn't interested in being discovered. And maybe that's for the best. Some things occupy ecological niches we're better off not understanding. Some territories belong to residents who were there before us and will outlast us. I don't go into deep forest anymore. I work in town now, processing timber data from an office with windows that look out on parking lots and strip malls. Safe, sterile, explicable. But on certain nights when the wind is right, I hear sounds that don't quite fit the urban soundscape. Vocalizations that blend familiar and alien in ways that make my skin crawl. And I remember that thing in the cave, the way it spoke with borrowed voice. And I wonder how many other borrowed voices it's collected since 2008. How many contractors and hikers and hunters have heard their own words played back to them from shadows that shouldn't speak. The forest keeps its secrets. Maybe that's why it's still forest. If something in the wilderness spoke to you in a voice it shouldn't have, would you stay to understand why? My name is Natalie, and for 6 years, I believed teaching was my calling. I loved everything about it. The lesson planning, the classroom dynamics, the moment when a difficult concept finally clicked for a struggling student. In March 2012, I was teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school on Westmount Drive in Okotoks, a pleasant suburban community south of Calgary where parents were involved and kids were generally well behaved. My classroom was orderly, my students engaged, and I took pride in maintaining an environment where learning felt safe and exciting. Then King transferred into my class halfway through the spring semester, and everything I thought I understood about childhood development and behavioral psychology became inadequate to explain what I witnessed over the following 3 months. King was 8 years old, small for his age, with dark hair and eyes that seemed older than they should have been. His parents, professional people who worked in Calgary, enrolled him after moving from Edmonton for job opportunities. The intake forms mentioned no behavioral issues, no learning disabilities, no red flags that would have prepared me for what came next. For the first week, King was quiet to the point of being nearly invisible. He completed assignments without complaint, ate lunch alone by choice rather than exclusion, and responded to questions with monosyllabic answers that were technically correct, but offered nothing beyond the minimum required. I recognized the pattern. New kid, unfamiliar environment, natural shyness. I gave him space to adjust, paired him with friendly students for group work, and waited for him to acclimate. Instead, he got stranger. The drawing started in week 2. During our morning art period, while other students created bright crayon pictures of families and pets and spring flowers, King produced images that made me pause when I collected them. Dark figures with too many limbs rendered in heavy black strokes. Symbols that looked almost like writing, but weren't any alphabet I recognized. Faces without features, surrounded by geometric patterns that hurt to look at for extended periods. I approached his desk during the next art session, knelt down to his level, and asked gently what he was drawing. He looked at me with those 2 old eyes, and said in a voice completely devoid of affect that he was drawing what he saw at night. When I asked what he meant, he returned to his work without answering. I made a note to discuss it with his parents at our upcoming conferences, filed it under possible trauma or stress indicators, and tried not to let it unsettle me as much as it did. But the drawings were just the beginning. King's behavior shifted dramatically over the next 2 weeks. He started speaking in complete, grammatically perfect sentences that sounded like they came from an adult rather than a third grader. Complex vocabulary, sophisticated syntax, observations that demonstrated knowledge he shouldn't have access to. During a reading circle, he corrected my pronunciation of a character's name, then explained the etymological origin of the word in terms that would have been appropriate for a university linguistics course. When I expressed surprise at his knowledge, he stared at me and said, "My maiden name, a name I hadn't used since getting married 4 years earlier, a name not listed in any school documentation." He said it casually, as if everyone knew it, then returned to his book. My hands were shaking so badly I had to excuse myself to get water from the staff room. King's parents reported equally disturbing changes at home. His mother called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight with stress she was trying to mask as concern. King had started sleepwalking, she said, leaving his bedroom and wandering the house speaking in a language she didn't recognize. She'd recorded some of it on her phone, played me a clip that made my skin crawl. The voice was King's, but the cadence was wrong, the phonemes harsh and guttural, nothing like English or any Romance language I'd studied in college. She asked if we'd been teaching foreign languages in class, if maybe he'd been watching videos online that might explain it. I told her no, we only did basic French immersion, and suggested she might want to consult their family doctor. After we hung up, I sat in my empty classroom, staring at King's most recent drawing tacked to the bulletin board. 7 circles arranged in a specific pattern, connected by lines that created shapes my brain kept trying to resolve into meaning but couldn't quite grasp. The incident that changed everything happened during reading time on a Tuesday morning. King had been unusually still all morning, sitting at his desk with his hands folded, staring at nothing. When I called on him to read the next paragraph, he didn't respond. I called his name again. His head turned toward me with mechanical precision, and his eyes were completely black, not the pupils dilated, the entire visible eye, sclera and all, rendered uniformly dark like someone had filled them with ink. I actually gasped, took a step backward, knocked over the water bottle on my desk. Before I could speak, King's body went rigid and he began convulsing, a full seizure that threw him from his chair onto the classroom floor. I sent my teaching aide running for the office while I tried to remember first aid protocols, positioning him on his side, clearing space around him, telling the other terrified students to move back. But King wasn't just seizing. While his body jerked and his muscles spasmed, he was talking, describing in perfect clinical detail how my grandmother had died 7 years earlier. He knew about the hospital room, the failing equipment, the time of death. He knew personal details I'd never shared with anyone. What she'd been wearing, what her last words had been, intimate family moments that should have been private. And his voice, when he spoke, wasn't his voice. It was layered, multiple tones speaking in unison, harmonics that shouldn't be physically possible for human vocal cords to produce. The worst part was what he said at the end, just before the principal and school nurse burst through the door. He turned his head to look directly at me despite the seizure still racking his body, and spoke in my grandmother's exact voice, perfect mimicry of her accent and speech patterns. He said, "You were supposed to visit me that day. I died alone because you chose work instead. I had canceled a hospital visit the day my grandmother died. I'd had parent-teacher conferences, responsibilities I couldn't reschedule, rationalizations that made sense at the time. I'd planned to visit the next day. She died before I got the chance, and that guilt had lived in me for 7 years, something I'd never discussed with anyone, not even my husband." Hearing those words in her voice coming from an 8-year-old boy actively seizing on my classroom floor broke something in me I still haven't fully repaired. The paramedics arrived, transported King to the hospital in Calgary, ran every neurological test available. They found nothing. No seizure activity on EEG, no structural abnormalities, no metabolic disorders, nothing that explained what had happened. He was discharged after 3 days of observation with a diagnosis of psychogenic non-epileptic seizure and a referral to pediatric psychiatry. King returned to school a week later with no memory of the incident. His parents asked that we not discuss it with him, that we treat him normally and alert them if any unusual behavior recurred. For 3 days, he was the quiet, withdrawn child I'd first met. Then during a parent meeting after school, just me, King's mother and father, and the principal discussing academic accommodations, King walked into the conference room. He shouldn't have been in the building. His mother had picked him up an hour earlier. We all watched him walk to the center of the room, turn to face me, and speak in that layered, multitonal voice I'd heard during the seizure. He said, "He wants me to show you what happens when you ignore your debts. He says guilt is a door that swings both ways." Then his eyes went black again, completely and utterly dark. And he smiled with too many teeth, more than should fit in a child's mouth. His father grabbed him, shook him, shouted his name. King blinked, and his eyes were normal again, brown and confused and frightened. He started crying, asked why everyone was staring at him, said he didn't know how he'd gotten there. His parents took him home immediately. The principal, a rational woman with 30 years in education, sat down heavily in her chair and said nothing for 5 full minutes. When she finally spoke, she suggested we contact the school district's crisis intervention team and possibly bring in religious counselors if the family was open to it. I asked her if she believed in possession. She looked at me with eyes that had seen something they couldn't categorize and said she believed in things she couldn't explain, and that this qualified. King's family withdrew him from school the following Monday, enrolled him in a different district, a different city. I heard through administrative channels that they'd consulted with a priest from a Catholic parish in Calgary, that there'd been some kind of intervention or blessing. I never got details, never found out what happened to King or if whatever had been speaking through him ever left. The principal had the classroom blessed too, quietly, without making it official school business. A priest came during spring break, performed rituals I wasn't present for, left holy water and specific instructions about disposal that the custodial staff followed without comment. The next school year started normally. New students, new challenges, familiar routines, but I never felt safe in that classroom again. I'd catch myself staring at empty corners, feeling watched. I'd hear children's voices in the hallway during prep periods when no classes were scheduled. Small things that could be explained rationally, but accumulated into a weight I couldn't carry. I requested a transfer to a different school for the following year, then decided maybe elementary education wasn't for me after all. I'm in corporate training now, teaching adults communication skills and software applications, sterile conference rooms, and PowerPoint presentations. No drawings in black crayon, no children with eyes that turn dark, no voices that shouldn't exist speaking truths that should have stayed buried. I still have one of King's drawings, though. I kept it despite knowing I shouldn't, despite the way it makes me feel when I look at it. 7 circles connected by lines, arranged in a pattern that means something I've never been able to decipher. Sometimes late at night when I'm alone, I take it out and study those symbols, trying to understand what King was seeing, what was seeing through him. The drawing never changes, but I swear the shadows around those circles shift depending on the angle of light, creating patterns within patterns that suggest depth and dimension that shouldn't exist on flat paper. My husband asked me once why I keep it if it disturbs me so much. I told him I keep it as a reminder that there are things in this world that don't obey the rules we think govern reality, and that sometimes those things notice us. Sometimes they speak through us, and sometimes they leave marks that never quite fade, symbols that mean something in languages we're better off never learning to read. King would be 16 now. I wonder sometimes if he remembers me, if he remembers any of what happened during those 3 months in 3rd grade. I wonder if that voice still visits him at night, speaking in layered tones that harmonize wrong, offering knowledge that carries too high a price. Mostly, I wonder if keeping that drawing was an invitation for it to find me again, and whether my guilt about my grandmother was the door it used to reach King, or if King's arrival in my classroom was the door it used to reach me. When something knows your deepest guilt, does that give it power over you? My name is Louisa, and July 1994 was the hottest summer on record in southern Alberta. I was 22 years old, working the graveyard shift at a service station on McLeod Trail just outside High River. The job paid minimum wage plus 20% for overnight hours, which was enough to cover rent on my apartment and tuition for the community college courses I was taking in the fall. The station sat isolated on a stretch of highway where traffic thinned to almost nothing after midnight, surrounded by dark fields that stretched toward mountains you could only see during daylight. Most nights I'd see maybe a dozen customers between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., long-haul truckers, shift workers heading home, the occasional tourist who'd misjudged their fuel gauge. It was boring work, the kind where you brought books to read and counted ceiling tiles to stay awake. I never felt unsafe. Crime was something that happened in cities, not on rural highways, where everyone knew everyone and strangers were notable enough to remember. The night of July 23rd started like any other. I clocked in at 11, relieved Damien, who worked the evening shift, and settled into the routine. Restocked the cold case, balanced the till, wiped down the counters. The air conditioning had broken 3 days earlier, and the owners were waiting on a part, so the station interior felt like a greenhouse. I propped open the back door to create airflow, positioned a fan to push hot air out, and accepted that I'd be sweating through my uniform shirt by midnight. Around 1 a.m., a semi pulled up to the diesel pumps, refueled, and the driver paid cash without conversation. Around 2:15, a couple in a sedan stopped for snacks and directions to a motel. Between customers, I read a paperback thriller I'd picked up at a yard sale. Something about a detective tracking a serial killer through the Pacific Northwest. The irony of that choice would occur to me later. At 2:47 a.m., a pickup truck pulled up to pump 6. I noticed it through the window. Older model Ford, primer gray, no license plates front or back. The driver got out wearing coveralls, the kind mechanics wear, and stood at the pump for longer than it should take to fuel up. I watched him on the security monitor behind the counter, black and white footage that made everything look grainy and indistinct. Something about his posture bothered me, the way he kept turning to look at the station, at the windows, at the door. When he finally came inside to pay, I got my first clear look at him. Middle-aged, weathered skin, dead eyes that didn't blink as often as they should. And what I'd thought was oil on his coveralls wasn't oil. The stains were wrong. Too dark in some places, too red-brown in others. The smell hit me when he approached the counter, a copper meat smell that made my stomach lurch. He paid for $40 of gas in exact change, counted out in bills that felt damp when I took them. His hands were stained too, crescents of dark material under his fingernails. I processed the payment quickly, wanted him gone, felt every instinct I possessed screaming that something was deeply wrong. He didn't leave. He stood at the counter staring at me, and when I asked if there was anything else, he smiled. His teeth were normal. That's what I remember most clearly, perfectly normal human teeth in a smile that had nothing human behind it. He asked what time I got off work. I lied and said my manager would be here in 20 minutes for shift change. He nodded slowly, said, "Okay," and walked out. I watched him drive away, watched his taillights disappear down the highway heading south, and immediately locked the front door. My hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 tries to get my phone out of my pocket. This was before cell phones were common, so I was using the station landline. But when I picked up the receiver, I got nothing. No dial tone, no static. Just dead silence. I traced the cord with growing panic and found where it had been cut, severed cleanly near where it entered through the wall by the back door I'd propped open for ventilation. The back door I'd left unlocked. I felt my bladder spasm with fear. He'd been inside while I was reading, while I was daydreaming, while I thought I was alone. He'd cut the phone line and left, driven around to the front, and come in through the customer entrance like a normal person making a normal transaction. This was planned. This was deliberate. He was coming back. I ran to the front door to make sure it was locked, checked the back door, and wedged a mop handle through the push bar so it couldn't open from outside. The station had security cameras, but no alarm system, no panic button, no way to call for help. The nearest building was a farmhouse 8 kilometers down the highway. I was alone in a glass box, surrounded by darkness, waiting for a man soaked in what I was now certain was blood to return and finish whatever he'd started. I turned off all the interior lights except the cooler case glow, grabbed the tire iron we kept under the counter, and crouched behind the register where I could see the parking lot but remain hidden from outside view. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound made my heart spike. I kept thinking about the detective novel I'd been reading, about how the killer in that story targeted women who worked alone at night, and wondering if that's where he'd gotten the idea. He came back at 3:27 a.m. I saw the headlights first, approaching from the south, moving slowly like he was searching. The truck pulled into the lot and parked sideways across the pumps, blocking the view from the highway. He got out carrying something long, a machete or large knife, the blade catching ambient light from the highway signs. He walked to the front door and tried the handle, found it locked. He stood there, looking through the glass, and I swear he could see me even though I was hidden in shadow. He traced one finger down the window, the same gesture he'd used on the pump earlier, leaving a red smear. Then he started circling the building. I heard his boots on gravel, heard him testing the back door, heard him try a window that thankfully didn't open more than 3 inches due to security bolts I'd never appreciated before that moment. The sound he made when he realized he couldn't get in easily was worse than any scream. It was frustration and rage and anticipation mixed together, a guttural noise that vibrated through the walls. He started talking, loud enough for me to hear through the glass, calling my name, Louisa. He said it over and over, pronounced it carefully like he'd been practicing. He'd read my name tag during that transaction, memorized it, and now he was using it to make this personal. He told me what he planned to do when he got inside, described it in clinical detail while I crouched behind the counter, with tears streaming down my face, and that tire iron gripped so hard my knuckles went white. He said I smelled like gasoline and sweat, that fear had a specific scent he'd learned to recognize, that he could tell I was young and that made it better somehow. I don't know how long he was out there. Time lost meaning. But at some point, 5:30, maybe later, I saw light on the horizon. Dawn. The sun rising over the prairie. And with the light came the rumble of a delivery truck. The weekly bread and snack delivery that arrived every Saturday between 5:30 and 6. I've never been so grateful to hear an engine. The man heard it too. He stopped talking mid-sentence, went silent, and I heard his boots crunch away across the gravel. By the time the delivery driver pulled in, the gray pickup was gone, just vanished like it had never been there, except for the smear on the window and the severed phone line and the absolute certainty in my gut that I'd barely survived something terrible. The delivery driver found me still crouched behind the counter, still holding that tire iron, shaking so hard I couldn't stand. He called the police from his radio. They arrived within 20 minutes, took my statement, photographed the blood smear on the window, and collected samples. The RCMP detective who interviewed me was kind but skeptical until they ran the blood type. Oh, negative. Didn't match me, didn't match any animal, but it did match blood found at an unsolved murder scene in Saskatchewan 3 weeks earlier. A woman who'd been working alone at a rural gas station, killed with an edged weapon, her body positioned in ways the detective wouldn't describe in detail. They found partial fingerprints on the window that matched prints from 2 other crime scenes in British Columbia and Manitoba. The man I'd encountered was responsible for at least 4 confirmed murders, possibly more, targeting women who worked isolated night shifts across Western Canada. The station owners installed a proper security system the following week. Panic buttons, reinforced locks, a policy that no one would work overnight alone anymore. But I'd already quit, walked away from that job and never went back, not even to collect my last paycheck. I had nightmares for months, would wake up sweating and certain I could smell copper and meat, certain I could hear boots on gravel circling my apartment building. I moved to Calgary that fall, enrolled in different courses, took a job in a busy coffee shop where I was never alone and where sunshine came through windows that faced a crowded street. I felt safer around people, in noise, in daylight that made shadows impossible. 9 years later, in 2003, I got a phone call from the RCMP. They'd arrested a man in British Columbia for an unrelated assault, and during the arrest, found evidence linking him to multiple murders across 3 provinces. They'd recovered items from his truck, personal effects taken from victims, photographs, detailed logs. In his wallet, they'd found a list written on a folded piece of paper, names in careful handwriting, women's names with locations and dates. Most were crossed off. 3 weren't, including mine. Louisa, High River, July 1994, got away. The detective told me the suspect had died in custody before trial, some kind of medical emergency or possibly suicide. Records weren't clear. He said I'd been incredibly lucky. That locked door and approaching delivery truck had probably saved my life. He asked if I had any questions. I asked if the man had ever said why, if there was any explanation for what drove him to target women like us. The detective was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Some people don't have reasons we'd understand." That trying to find logic in that kind of evil was pointless. He was probably right. I still live in Calgary, work in an office with fluorescent lights and security guards and dozens of coworkers. I don't drive rural highways at night. I don't stop at isolated gas stations. I don't work jobs where I'd ever be alone with strangers in buildings made of glass. The memory has dulled over time, become less visceral, but it never completely fades. Sometimes I'll catch a smell, copper, something organic, and I'm back in that station, crouched behind the counter, listening to boots circle the building, while a voice calls my name with anticipation that sounds almost like joy. I was entry number 8 on his list. 7 women before me didn't get away. 3 women after me would have died if that delivery truck hadn't shown up when it did, if I'd worked different shifts, if any number of small variables had aligned differently, luck and timing. That's the margin between being a survivor and being a statistic. I try not to think about it too often. I try to focus on the life I've built, the safety I've created, the distance I've put between that night and now. But I know his name now. The detective told me when they confirmed his identity. And knowing that name somehow makes it worse, gives shape and specificity to what had been anonymous evil. He was a real person with a history and a job, and neighbors who described him as quiet and private. He existed in normal spaces doing normal things, and none of that normalcy prevented him from becoming something monstrous. Would you have unlocked the door if someone was circling your workplace at night, calling your name? My name is Nico, and I've worked as a municipal clerk in Cochrane for 14 years. It's steady employment, the kind of government position where you process forms and maintain records and rarely encounter anything unexpected. Property deeds, tax assessments, building permits, zoning applications. The bureaucratic machinery that keeps a small town functioning runs through my office in an endless stream of paper and digital files. I'm good at this work. Detail-oriented, methodical, comfortable with the tedious precision required to maintain accurate municipal records. In May 2021, during a routine audit of historical property tax files, I discovered something that shouldn't exist. An address that appears in every database, generates monthly payments, and maintains perfect compliance with municipal regulations despite being located in a field where no structure has ever stood. The anomaly first appeared while I was reconciling property tax accounts from the 1970s forward, updating our digital system with archived paper records. I noticed a residential address on Birchwood Close that kept appearing in assessment rolls going back to 1975. The property was listed as a single-family dwelling, assessed at values consistent with similar homes in that neighborhood, with continuous tax payments from the same account holder for 46 years. What caught my attention was the street name, Birchwood Close. I'd lived in Cochrane my entire life, knew every street and cul-de-sac in town, and I'd never heard of Birchwood Close. I pulled up the town planning maps, cross-referenced with postal records, checked the Master Street Registry maintained by Public Works. Birchwood Close didn't exist, not as a current street, not as a renamed street, not even as a planned development that never materialized. It simply wasn't there and never had been. But the records insisted otherwise. Property tax payments for 47 Birchwood Close arrived like clockwork, processed through automatic bank withdrawal on the 1st of every month. Utility bills for electrical service, water, and sewage showed normal residential consumption patterns. Assessment records included property inspections conducted every 5 years as required by provincial regulation, with notes describing a well-maintained bungalow with updated roofing and modern windows. I pulled the most recent inspection report from 2019. The inspector had photographed the property, included measurements, noted minor issues with foundation settling, and recommended gutter repairs. The photographs showed a beige stucco house with burgundy trim, a neat lawn, flower beds along the front walk, and a mailbox marked with the number 47. I stared at those images for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The metadata confirmed the photos were taken in July 2019 at coordinates that, according to every map in our system, corresponded to an empty field 3 blocks from the actual residential development. I should have brought this to my supervisor immediately, standard protocol for records discrepancies, but something about the situation bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate, and I wanted to understand it before escalating. During my lunch break, I drove to the location, used my phone's GPS, punched in the coordinates from the inspection report, and followed the directions to a vacant lot on the northern edge of town. Undeveloped land scheduled for future subdivision, but currently just native grassland bordered by established neighborhoods. I parked on the shoulder and walked into the field. The ground showed no indication of previous construction, no foundation remnants, no utility connections, no depression in the earth where a basement might have settled over decades. Just grass and wildflowers, and ground that had clearly never been disturbed by development. I took photographs from multiple angles, documented the GPS coordinates, and tried to reconcile the emptiness before me with the detailed records of a house that supposedly occupied this exact space. Back at the office, I expanded my investigation, cross-referenced census data going back to 1976. The household at 47 Birchwood Close was consistently recorded as occupied by 4 residents, 2 adults and 2 children. The names changed slightly over the years, suggesting generational turnover, but the family structure remained constant. Voter registration lists included residents of that address in every municipal and provincial election since 1980. School enrollment records showed children from 47 Birchwood Close attending Cochrane schools, with standardized test scores and attendance records that looked entirely normal. Emergency services logs referenced the address 3 times, a false alarm fire call in 1989, a medical assistance request in 2003, and a noise complaint in 2017. The responding officer's reports described the property and interactions with residents in routine detail that suggested nothing unusual. I was reading through the medical assistance report when my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, local area code, but not in our municipal directory. I answered using my standard greeting, giving my name and department. The voice on the other end was distant, like the person was calling from the bottom of a well or through multiple layers of poor connection. They identified themselves as a resident of 47 Birchwood Close, calling to report an issue with water pressure that had been ongoing for several weeks. They wanted to know why the Public Works Department hadn't responded to their previous service request. The voice was polite but frustrated, the tone of someone who'd been trying to resolve a minor municipal issue through proper channels and felt ignored. I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened and closed without producing sound, while my brain tried to process the impossibility of what was happening. I finally managed to ask them to hold, place them on mute, and sat staring at the blinking line indicator. The water service complaint database showed an open ticket filed 3 weeks earlier for 47 Birchwood Close, categorized as low priority, assigned to a technician who'd apparently never followed up. I unmuted the line and told the caller I'd look into the issue and someone would contact them within 48 hours. They thanked me, mentioned they'd lived at this address for 12 years and never had problems before, and hoped this could be resolved quickly. The call ended. I immediately tried calling the number back and got a recording stating the number was not in service. I pulled up the reverse lookup database. The number was registered to a landline at 47 Birchwood Close, installed in 1978, with continuous service since then billed to the same account that paid the property taxes. I felt reality sliding sideways, the solid ground of documented evidence and bureaucratic process becoming suddenly unreliable. That evening, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I accessed my personal notes from 2019, a digital journal I kept during a particularly stressful period when my therapist recommended documenting my thoughts to manage anxiety. In an entry dated June 2019, I'd written extensively about investigating property records for Birchwood Close, described the same discrepancies I'd just discovered, expressed the same confusion about an address that existed in documents but not in physical space. I had no memory of writing that entry, no memory of conducting that investigation 2 years earlier, no memory of whatever conclusion I'd reached or what had prompted me to stop pursuing the matter. The realization that I'd been through this exact process before and somehow forgotten it entirely made my hands shake badly enough that I had to close my laptop and sit in darkness trying to control my breathing. The next morning, I reported my findings to my supervisor, showed her the compiled evidence, asked her advice on how to proceed. She listened patiently, reviewed the documents I'd prepared, then pulled a folder from her locked filing cabinet. Inside were my own handwritten notes from 2019 documenting the same investigation, reaching the same dead ends. She said I'd brought this to her attention before, that we'd discussed it at length, and that I'd agreed to simply continue processing the payments and maintaining the records as if everything was normal. She said some municipal anomalies don't have solutions we're equipped to find, and that the best course of action was to document the discrepancy internally and otherwise treat 47 Birchwood Close as a standard property. I asked her why I didn't remember any of this. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret and suggested that sometimes our minds protect us from information we're not ready to process. I wanted to argue, to insist on further investigation, to contact provincial authorities, or hire independent surveyors, or do something that would definitively resolve whether this property existed or not. But, looking at my supervisor's face, at the careful neutrality in her expression, I understood that this conversation was over, and that pushing further would have professional consequences I wasn't prepared to face. So I agreed. I went back to my desk, filed the folder with my investigation notes in the same drawer, where apparently I'd filed identical notes 2 years earlier, and resumed processing the endless stream of municipal paperwork. The property tax payment for 47 Birchwood Close cleared the next day, exactly on schedule, as it had for 46 years. I check the records monthly now, compulsively, unable to help myself, despite knowing it serves no practical purpose. The payments never stop. The family of 4 continues to consume utilities at rates consistent with normal residential usage. School enrollment records show children graduating and presumably leaving home, then new children enrolling years later, maintaining that constant population of 4 residents across generations. The property appreciates in value at rates identical to neighboring homes in the development that does exist. Everything operates according to perfectly normal patterns for perfectly normal suburban residents that occupies space in our bureaucratic reality, but not in our physical geography. Last month, I drove past that empty field again, parked in the same spot, walked to the exact coordinates where the house should stand. The grass was undisturbed, but in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of where my eyes could focus, I thought I saw something. A flicker, a suggestion of structure, a mailbox post, the briefest impression of windows reflecting afternoon sun. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing but grass and sky. I don't trust my own perception anymore. I don't trust my memory. I've started keeping duplicate journals, one digital and one handwritten, both locked with passwords, documenting these investigations so that if I forget again, I'll have evidence of my previous awareness. But I've found other entries, older ones, going back to 2017 and 2015, documenting the same process of discovery and documentation and forced acceptance. How many times have I been through this cycle? How many times have I found Birchwood Close, investigated its impossible existence, been convinced to let it go, and then somehow lost all memory of the experience? Am I the only one this happens to, or does everyone who looks too closely at this particular anomaly eventually find their memories edited, their certainty eroded, their investigation looping back to the beginning? The new tenant started working here last month, a young woman fresh out of university with a degree in public administration. I've watched her organizing files, updating databases, processing records with the same methodical attention to detail I once brought to this work. Yesterday, I saw her pause while reviewing property tax accounts, saw her pull up a street map, saw the exact expression of confusion cross her face that I recognize from my own reflection. She'll find Birchwood Close. She'll investigate. She'll discover all the same impossibilities I've documented multiple times and apparently forgotten. Part of me wants to warn her, to show her my journals, to explain that this investigation leads nowhere except to doubt and memory loss and the creeping certainty that reality operates according to rules we're not equipped to understand. But I don't. I just watch and wait, wondering if she'll bring it to my attention, wondering what I'll tell her when she does, wondering if this time I'll remember any of it 6 months from now. The house at 47 Birchwood Close continues to exist in the space between documentation and reality, occupying bureaucratic dimensions that don't map to physical geography. The family continues to pay their taxes, consume their utilities, live their lives in a structure I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of, and I continue to process their payments, maintain their records, and try not to think too hard about the implications of a town that contains addresses which exist only in the collective agreement of our filing systems. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's just the one property, or if there are others. How many phantom streets might exist in our records? How many ghost families living in houses that occupy some liminal space between what we document and what we experience? The thought keeps me awake more than I'd like to admit. But every morning I return to work, boot up my computer, and process another day's worth of paperwork for properties I assume are real because the alternative is too disturbing to sustain. Would you trust official records that contradict your own eyes? My name is Kelly, and I became curator of the Claresholm Heritage Museum in September 2024 after spending 6 years working collections management at institutions across Alberta. The position seemed perfect. A small-town museum housed in a century-old mansion, managing artifacts that told the story of early ranching settlement in the region. The building itself was the primary attraction, a Victorian Gothic structure built in 1903 by the Henderson family, wealthy cattle barons who'd accumulated a fortune during the territory days before Alberta became a province. The mansion had been donated to the Historical Society in 1975, after the last Henderson descendant died without heirs, converted into a museum that preserved both the building and the family's extensive collection of period furnishings, photographs, and personal effects. It was beautiful work, the kind of position historians dream about, managing artifacts in their original context, maintaining a physical connection to the past. My predecessor, Bodie, had left detailed notes about the collection's organization, the cataloging system he'd developed, and the ongoing restoration projects planned for various rooms. What he didn't leave was any explanation for why he'd resigned so abruptly after only 8 months in the position, or why he'd never responded to my emails requesting information about specific artifacts. The museum board dismissed his departure as a personal matter, assured me the transition would be smooth, and seemed eager to move past whatever had prompted his exit. I accepted their explanation and focused on learning the collection, familiarizing myself with the mansion's layout, and preparing for the busy tourist season that would begin the following spring. The building felt welcoming during those first weeks. Sunlight through the tall windows illuminated wood paneling and antique furniture in warm tones that made the past feel close but not threatening, historical but not haunted. The renovation began in late October. The museum board had secured grant funding to restore the second floor's western wing, sections that had been closed to the public for years due to structural concerns about the original plaster walls. The contractor, Daryl, was a preservation specialist who'd worked on historical buildings throughout southern Alberta. He started by documenting the existing conditions, taking measurements and photographs before any intervention. On the third day of assessment work, he discovered the sealed room. It was hidden behind a false wall in what the original floor plans designated as a linen closet, accessible only after removing several layers of plaster and lath that had been deliberately installed to conceal the entrance. The door behind that wall was original to the house, solid oak with ornate brass hardware, locked with a mechanism that had seized decades ago. Daryl called me to see it before proceeding, following proper protocols for unexpected architectural discoveries in heritage buildings. We forced the lock carefully, preserving as much of the original hardware as possible. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed from lack of use, revealing a room approximately 12 feet square that smelled of dust and something else. Lavender, maybe, or some other organic scent that had been trapped for generations. The space was a shrine. Victorian mourning photography covered every wall, those unsettling post-mortem portraits popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where deceased family members were posed as if sleeping or sitting naturally among the living. Children mostly. Pale faces with closed eyes, dressed in formal clothing, held by parents whose expressions combined grief and stoic acceptance. In one corner stood a dress form displaying a child's white dress, yellowed with age. In another, a glass case contained 3 sets of small clothing, all children's garments from approximately 1918 based on the style. Around the room's perimeter were arranged locks of hair, each secured with ribbon and labeled with names and dates. Emma Henderson, born 1909, died 1918. Thomas Henderson, born 1911, died 1918. Sarah Henderson, born 1913, died 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic. On a small writing desk near the window sat a leather-bound journal. I opened it carefully, aware that I was probably the first person to touch it in over a century. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, entries dated from October 1918 through March 1919, penned by Eleanor Henderson, matriarch of the family. The early entries described the children's illnesses, the helplessness of watching them deteriorate despite every medical intervention available at the time, the unbearable grief of losing all three within a single week. Those passages were heartbreaking but comprehensible. The documented sorrow of a mother experiencing the worst possible tragedy. The later entries became disturbing. Eleanor wrote about refusing to accept their deaths, about consulting with a traveling spiritualist who'd passed through Claresholm in December 1918, about conducting seances in this room using personal effects and locks of hair to create connections with the deceased. She described elaborate rituals, specific words and gestures, offerings made to entities she believed could breach the boundary between life and death. The final entries, written in increasingly frantic handwriting, described success. Eleanor claimed the children had returned. They walked the hallways at night. They responded when she called their names. But something was wrong. The journal entries became disjointed. Observations recorded without context or explanation. Emma's eyes don't blink anymore. Thomas moves wrong. His joints bend backward. Sarah speaks, but her mouth stays closed. The last entry, dated March 15th, 1919, consisted of only one sentence repeated over and over until the page was covered in ink. They wear their faces, but they're not my children. They're not my children. They're not my children. After that, blank pages. The journal ended without resolution or explanation. I stood in that sealed room holding that journal, while Daryl photographed the space, documenting everything for the historical record, and I felt cold despite the afternoon sun warming the rest of the mansion. I should have reported the discovery immediately to the museum board, should have contacted the Provincial Heritage Authority, should have followed proper protocols for significant architectural findings. Instead, I stayed in that room after Daryl left for the day, reading through the journal again, examining the morning photographs, trying to understand what Eleanor Henderson had experienced in this space over a century ago. The light was fading, dusk settling over the mansion in shades of blue and purple, when I heard the laughter. Children's laughter, bright and clear, coming from the hallway just outside the room. The museum was closed. I was supposed to be alone in the building. I told myself it was neighborhood kids playing outside, sound carrying through the old windows. But the laughter was inside. I could hear the acoustics of the hallway, the way sound bounced off the wood paneling and tall ceilings. Small running footsteps accompanied the laughter, multiple children, moving past the room and down the corridor. I stepped into the hallway and saw nothing. Empty space stretching toward the staircase, lit by the emergency exit signs that were the only modern additions to the original architecture. The laughter had stopped. I checked every room on that floor, methodical and increasingly nervous, finding nothing out of place and no explanation for what I'd heard. I was returning to the sealed room to collect my belongings and leave when I noticed the photographs. The morning portraits of Eleanor Henderson's 3 children, the ones that had been hanging on the walls when I'd first entered hours earlier. I hadn't studied them closely then, disturbed by the practice of photographing the dead. Now, looking at them in the failing light, I saw something that made my breath catch. In the photograph showing all 3 children posed together in their death clothes, their eyes were open. I was certain they'd been closed earlier. Post-mortem photography specifically posed subjects with closed eyes to create the illusion of peaceful sleep. But these children stared directly at the camera with eyes that seemed too aware, too focused, reflecting the photographer's flash in ways that made the pupils look wrong. I left the mansion immediately, didn't bother locking the sealed room, just grabbed my phone and coat and walked quickly to my car. At home that evening, I tried to convince myself I'd misremembered the photographs, that the stress of discovering a hidden room and reading a grieving mother's desperate journal had distorted my perception. I pulled up the digital copies Daryl had taken earlier, zoomed in on the photographs he'd captured of the walls. In his images, the children's eyes were clearly closed, exactly as post-mortem photography convention dictated. I had no rational explanation for what I'd seen. I wanted to believe I'd been mistaken, that fading light and an unsettling environment had created an optical illusion. But I knew what I'd observed. Those eyes had been open, and they'd been looking at something beyond the camera, beyond the room, with expressions that combined innocence and something fundamentally wrong. I called Bodie that night, tracked down his number through mutual professional contacts, reached him at his home in Medicine Hat, where he'd relocated after leaving the museum. He listened to my description of the sealed room and the journal without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence before he spoke. He told me he'd found the room too, 6 months into his tenure, during a routine inspection of the second floor. He'd read the journal, documented the space, reported it to the board. They'd instructed him to seal it again, to forget about it, to say nothing to visitors or researchers. He'd tried to follow those instructions but couldn't. He'd started seeing things in the museum after dark. Small figures in the hallways, handprints on windows too high for children to reach, his name spoken in voices that sounded young and wrong. The final incident that prompted his resignation involved finding all 3 sets of children's clothing arranged on the floor in the main exhibit hall, positioned as if bodies were lying in them when the building had been locked and alarmed overnight. He'd cleaned up the display before anyone else arrived, submitted his resignation that afternoon, and never returned. He advised me to do the same. He said some historical buildings contain more than artifacts and architecture, that Eleanor Henderson's desperate rituals had opened something that never properly closed, and that whatever walked those hallways wasn't the children she'd lost. I thanked him for his honesty, hung up, and sat in my apartment trying to decide what to do. I loved museum work. I'd trained for years to reach a position like this, but I couldn't unknow what I'd learned or unsee what I'd witnessed. The next morning, I went back to the mansion to begin the process of properly documenting the sealed room for the archives, following professional protocols regardless of personal discomfort. The door was closed. Not just closed, sealed. Fresh plaster covered the entrance, applied overnight with professional precision that matched the surrounding wall perfectly. Daryl swore he hadn't done the work, seemed genuinely confused about who would have sealed it without authorization. The museum board, when I contacted them, claimed no knowledge of the action. They suggested perhaps Daryl had misremembered, that maybe the wall had always been solid and the door had been in a different location. Their explanation made no sense given the photographic documentation from the previous day, but they were insistent. The sealed room had never been opened. No discovery had been made. The renovations would proceed as planned, working around that section. I pushed back, insisted on reviewing the photographs, demanded explanation for the obvious evidence contradicting their claims. The board chair, an elderly woman who'd lived in Claresholm for 70 years, invited me to her home for a private conversation. She told me things about the Henderson mansion that weren't in any official history, stories passed down through families who'd worked for the Hendersons or known Eleanor in her final years. She confirmed that Eleanor had indeed attempted to bring her children back through spiritualist rituals, and that something had responded to those attempts. She told me the room had been sealed by Eleanor's husband in 1919 and reopened 3 times since then, in 1947, 1982, and now 2024. Each time whoever discovered it experienced increasingly disturbing phenomena until the room was sealed again. She said the Historical Society had learned to simply accept this pattern, to seal the room when it was found, and wait for collective memory to fade before the next inevitable discovery. I resigned my position 2 weeks later. Couldn't justify staying in a building where the boundaries between history and horror had blurred beyond distinction, where the administration preferred denial to acknowledgement. A new curator was hired within a month, Someone young and enthusiastic who knew nothing about sealed rooms or desperate mothers or Victorian rituals gone wrong. I moved back to Calgary, took a position with a modern corporate archive that manages digital records in climate-controlled facilities with no history beyond the last decade. Safe, sterile, free of ghosts. But I kept copies of the photographs from that sealed room, kept digital scans of the journal pages I'd been able to capture before everything was resealed. Sometimes I compare the images, looking at those children's faces in their post-mortem portraits, trying to determine if their eyes are open or closed, if the photographs themselves change depending on when and how I view them. I can never be certain. The images seem to shift based on factors I don't understand, subtle changes that might be artifacts of different screen resolutions, or might be something else entirely. Last week, I received a message from someone claiming to be the new curator at the Claresholm Museum. She'd found my contact information in archived emails, wanted to ask about restoration work conducted on the second floor. Specifically, she wanted to know if I had any documentation about a sealed room that contractors had recently discovered behind a false wall. The message included a photograph, the oak door with ornate brass hardware, newly exposed, apparently found during routine maintenance. The cycle continues. Someone discovers the room, reads the journal, experiences the phenomena, and eventually either seals it again or flees. I haven't responded to her message. I don't know what I could tell her that would help. The truth sounds like delusion. The evidence contradicts official records. The board will deny everything and seal the room again once she's gone. All I can do is save these photographs and this account, document what I witnessed, and hope that someday someone will assemble enough testimonies from enough curators to establish a pattern that can't be dismissed as individual instability. Until then, the Henderson Mansion stands on its quiet street in Claresholm, welcoming tourists who admire its Victorian architecture and period furnishings, unaware that somewhere behind its walls is a room where a mother's grief became something terrible, and where 3 children, who aren't children anymore, still wait in the dark, wearing faces they no longer own. Would you open a door that generations of people have tried to keep sealed? That's 9 true horror stories from Alberta's small towns where reality fractured and witnesses will never be the same. These accounts remind us that darkness doesn't only dwell in cities. It thrives in quiet places where secrets can fester for generations. If you survived these tales, hit subscribe to Unheard Fears for more disturbing true stories. Ring that notification bell and share your own unexplainable experiences in the comments below.